Huron Blackheart is the former chapter master of the Astral Claws. Drawn to chaos through an ambitious pursuit of power, he now leads the chaotic warband known as the Red Corsairs. Unfortunately, the miniature representation of this infamous character is looking a little dated now, but armed with my Chaos Space Marine bits box, I'll be attempting to create an up-to-date version of this corrupted Astartes. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video, I'll be kitbashing Huron Blackheart. The basis for this conversion was the unit champion from the Chaos Havocs kit. Havocs are excellent as they are slightly bulkier than your regular Chaos Space Marines. This is perfect for representing a more highly ranked Chaos Space Marine. Not only does it give the impression of gifts from the Chaos Gods, increasing his size, but it also allows the character to stand out a little more on the battlefield. I removed all the parts required to assemble the legs and torso of the champion before removing sprue tabs and mold lines using my knife. To create Huron's torso, I needed something that featured the traditional Chaos banding, which, unfortunately, the Havoc's torso didn't have. To get around this, I used a spare chest panel from the Scarab Occult Terminators. This not only had the desired edging, but as it was also from a Terminator, it worked as a throwback to Huron's previous Loyalist armour. I wouldn't have been able to use this Terminator torso as a straight replacement for the Havocs, but with some adjustment, I could get this fitting over the top. I began by clipping the inside support structure of the Terminator's torso front. These cuts were continued, removing progressively more of the Occult Terminator's torso and cutting back the Havoc's torso to allow them to fit together. During this process, I made use of a mixture of my scalpel, file and clippers and made frequent comparisons between the parts. This ensured that the cuts I was making were being done in the correct location and in the correct amounts. I carried on making these adjustments to both halves until the Terminator torso could fit nicely over the top of the Havoc's torso. Huron's armour bears extensive damage from a near-fatal wound following his rebellion. As such, his armour remains damaged and he is kept alive by a series of infernal cybernetics. To represent these on the model, I decided to fracture the chest plate in half. I started with my saw and then cut the plate just off to one side of the centre point. Once cut, I used my knife to create a slightly more jagged looking edge. With the cut made, these two halves were then glued to the Havoc's torso. Whilst the glue was still a little fresh, I brought in my cybernetic cables, more commonly known as cheap guitar strings. The ridges in these are perfect for representing scale wires and cables. Using a couple of different size strings, I clipped them to length before gluing them into the gap in the armour with some super glue. The result was that of exposed cybernetics beneath Huron's damaged armour. With the front plate of the torso completed, I began to assemble the rest of the torso and part of the legs, including the front plate and the chainmail tabard. I wanted to carry on with the construction of the cybernetics, so I used my pin vise to drill a 1mm wide hole just behind the side of that central plate. I then grabbed some more guitar string and superglued this into the hole. I wrapped this along Huron's right side and around to his back. It was then clipped to length so that it extended just past the connecting point of the power pack. I drilled another hole into the back and superglued the other end of the wire into this hole too. By using the holes as anchor points, I was able to counteract the slightly firmer and hollow to bend guitar wire, giving it a much sturdier fit. With the torso cabling completed, I continued to assemble the legs. With the bulk of the torso finished, I could work on Huron's Tyrant's Claw. This taloned power fist with integrated heavy flamer was based on a Warp Talon's Lightning Claw. It was already correctly positioned for the pose that I was looking to recreate here, but there was a little clash between the new torso and the shoulder. This was resolved by using my scalpel to trim back the top corner. I made a few comparisons here to ensure that the cuts were being made correctly. However, I didn't attach the arm just yet. Instead, to feed that integrated heavy flamer, I wanted to add some additional cabling. So again, I drilled two holes, this time into the back of the hand, ever so slightly offset from each other. Into these holes, I glued more guitar wire. I clipped this off the spool and left more than enough length to be able to reach the Huron's power pack. After allowing this glue to dry, I bent the wires ever so slightly upwards and also inwards. To contain the promethium required to fuel Huron's heavy flamer, I wanted to next add some tanks to his power pack. To do this, I used the default Havoc Champion backpack alongside the flame tanks from Acadian Shock Troop sprue. From doing a rough comparison between the two, I I could see that if I positioned it horizontally as per Huron's original model, the tanks would fit quite nicely into the top section of the backpack, but I would need to fill in the gap just below them. The simplest way to solve this was to just saw in half the section that would normally have been attached to the backpack. I cut just above halfway up the small disc with my saw before cleaning up and gluing this into place. Before the tanks could be attached, they needed a few adjustments too. I clipped away the pipes that would normally sit at the bottom, and then used my knife to clean up the valves and to carefully shave back the small skulls. Once this had been smoothed out, I could then glue the tanks to the backpack. Huron's original model features a large spiked halo atop his pack, no doubt a parody of the saintly appearance of the Imperium's iron halos. If you see my word bearer conversion, then you will recognise the brass collar that I decided to use to recreate this. These come from the Mighty Skullcrushers set, and in order to make this one fit, I needed to clip it in half. I compared the fit again after the cut, and found that I still needed to trim it back a little further in order to get the best fit against the two struts. I made a further few trims to the pack and the collar using my knife, which just helped to improve that bond. After gluing, I was left with a completed backpack. When planning out this conversion, I took my inspiration from this particular piece of artwork. The piece depicts Huron alongside a few of his fellow Corsairs, but the reason I was drawn to this piece in particular was the corpse being immolated in his gauntlet. I thought this was an excellent way to both demonstrate his heavy flamer and also the crueler aspect of his personality. To recreate this, I started with the corpse carrying arm from the Crypt Gore set. I clipped away the arm and trimmed this clean, leaving me with just the torso. However, in order to place this into the gauntlet's palm, I needed to flatten both the back side of the torso as well as some of the details at the centre of the palm. This would not only create a better bond when gluing, but also create a more realistic position. Once this was done, I glued the torso into place. To represent the tongues of flame licking out around the corpse, I turned to some green stuff. I cut an equal amount of the blue and yellow halves, leaving the touch point in the centre alone. This helps to avoid already cured bits of green stuff getting into your mix and making it lumpy. Using plenty of Vaseline or water to prevent sticking, I mixed the two colours and rolled a small amount into a short tube. I pinched one end to create a rough teardrop shape and then, with my sculpting tool, flattened it out to one side. This helped to create the rough shape of a flame. I repeated this a few times with slightly varying sizes and shapes of droplet before attaching these around the sides of the body. I smoothed these out beneath the torso, helping to both blend them in and also to create a better bond. While I still had some green stuff mixed up, I rolled out two small balls that I would be using later on and left all the green stuff to cure overnight before progressing with the conversion. Now that everything had cured, I could attach both the backpack and the right arm to the torso. With both of these items in place, I now had a much better idea of how much of the guitar string that I actually needed. I checked the length by bending the wire around to the top of the pack before cutting them with my clippers. These were both superglued into a gap between the fuel tank and the backpack, completing the connection with the arm. With the right arm completed, I could work on the left. In it, Huron carries a power axe which was easily sourced from the Chaos Space Marine kit, but Huron's axe has one unique feature, and that is the iron halo taken from a Carcharodon captain. To find an iron halo, I dug out a leftover power pack from a Primus captain, but there are a number of kits that these can be found in. So I began by first removing the rear spike from the axe with my clippers before carefully cutting away the iron halo. I wanted to retain as much of the support strut as possible here, and so I used my knife, which gave me the most precision. Once removed, both of these items were cleaned up. To give the iron halo a little more sturdiness, I decided to pin it to the axe. I began by drilling a shallow hole into the base of the iron halo before drilling a second into the rear of the axe, where the two parts would line up. I grabbed some 1mm thick steel florist wire and superglued this into the halo. Once dried, I clipped the wire so that only a couple of millimeters were left protruding, before then gluing this into the hole in the axe. This created a far stronger bond than if I just relied on glue alone. With the customizations to the axe finished, I then glued this to one of the Havoc arms before gluing this into the torso. For the left shoulder pad, I wanted to recreate the style of the original model as best as I could. I took this pad from the Havoc's kit that featured the Chaos Star and then set about removing the bottom trim. This was done with my knife. I carefully shaved away small amounts until the surface was smooth and flat. Once completed, this was glued to the left arm. At this point, the body was complete and I just needed to add a head. Finding something scarred and damaged as the original model proved tricky, especially when it had to be in scale with a Space Marine. I ultimately settled on this head from the Chaos Terminator Lord kit. It already had a good number of cables and wires around it, but I wanted to add one more. So like before, I started off by drilling a hole into the right side of the head. I took another piece of guitar wire and bent it at the very end by 90 degrees. This was glued against the head and then cut just below the jawline. I didn't attach the head just yet, as I decided to keep it separate to make it easier to paint. The final step in building Huron himself was to create some small vials of noxious liquid. I began by cutting 2 small discs out of some 3mm diameter plastic rod with my knife. These were then superglued to the tops of the green stuff balls that I'd made earlier. This created the appearance of a cap on the top of a vial, and after being allowed to dry, was then glued to Huron's waist. But Huron isn't just a singular model. He is accompanied by a small demonic familiar called a Hamadryah. To recreate this diminutive being, I began with one of the small familiars found in the Genestealer Brood Coven. After cleaning up the parts, I then proceeded to shave away the ridges along the back. In addition to this, I also trimmed back the shoulder pads and flattened out the small ridge sections on the arms and the legs, all of which was done with my knife. This helped to tone down the Genestealer aspect of the components. Once done, I glued the 2 halves together. For the head, I grabbed a Genestealer skull, which also meant that I could easily shoehorn some dead animal bits into this video too. Again, I toned down the Tyrant aspect by shaving down the forehead ridges before trimming the back of the neck. This allowed for a much better fit when I glued it to the rest of the body. At this point, the Hamadryah was looking a bit dead and still too Genestealery. I tried to resolve this by first supergluing 2 1mm diameter ball bearings into the eye sockets, which resulted in a rather hilarious looking expression. To tone this down a bit, I used a little more green stuff. I started by rolling out a small thin sausage and placed this at the side of the eye. I used my sculpting tool to bring this around beneath the eye and to smooth it out against the rest of the head. A slightly larger green stuff sausage was then added to the forehead before being blended out into the rest of the skull and over the tops of the eyes. This resulted in a slightly less goofy looking sidekick. The green stuff also helped to offset the more skeletal features of the face and helped to further distance it from the Genestealer basis of the model. So all that I needed to do now was to base and paint the models, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Huron Blackheart with his Hamadryah, painted in the colours of the red Corsairs. Now this is the first time I've tackled a Chaos Space Marine character in any one of my videos, and it was a pretty fun challenge. Finding the right parts was a little more tricky than with some of the Primus characters, but I think the end result is something that is more in line with modern Chaos Minis, whilst also being recognisable as Huron Blackheart. The Hamadryah is probably what looks the most different. Finding something small enough that still looked like the original proved quite tricky. Mine kind of looks like a 40k version of Gollum, which I'm actually perfectly okay with. So if you enjoyed this Chaos Space Marine kit bashing video, then please do leave me a like, along with your suggestions for other character builds that you'd like to see me tackle in the future. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Stuart Smith, Jeremy Kaup, Jake, Douglas Wilson, and Daniel Dowling. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee or you just use my affiliates links. Then your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these different kinds of conversions for you. If you'd like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of the relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.